stem the tide of the war. This turned out to be total fantasy. The fighting there soon descended into trench warfare and stalemate. But the Allies wouldn't call it off, and this week they tried something new. This is the Great War. Last week, we took a look at the chaos at home in Russia being caused by their recent losses in the field. And they were massive. For 2 months, Austro-German forces had pushed them relentlessly back until we countered our offensive. And last week, had retaken Lemberg, the capital of Austrian Galicia. The Austro-Hungarian army had also held its ground in the south. The Italians made their first major attack of the war. I did not talk about either the Western Front or Gallipoli last week, so that's what I'm going to start off with today. British General Aylmer Hunter Weston and his French counterpart Gallipoli decided to stop making general advances and instead concentrate all artillery to support localized attacks, fighting off a small chunk of the Turkish lines and then basically creating a wall of shells to help hold off the counterattack. The French tried this out first. On June 21st, they launched an attack take the Turkish trenches. They were supported by so many 75mm guns, howitzers, trench mortars, British howitzers that it worked out into one gun or howitzer for every 10 meters of the assault. They also had batteries of guns firing on the rest of the Turkish lines to prevent support. Long-range batteries hammering at the Turkish guns on the Asian side of the Dardanelles. The trenches were close, so there was little margin for error. After a final bombardment of 45 minutes, the French charged at 6 a.m. By mid-afternoon, they had taken several of their targets and then drew back the first counterattack. But the problem with taking the Turkish front lines in many cases was that trenches had basically been destroyed by artillery and were soaked in corpses, so there was no shelter. The French were driven back, but came on again. They were ultimately successful. They captured Aripolida, 500 casualties and inflicting nearly 6,000. It was the British turn on the 28th at Gully Spear and Gully Ravine. They would be supported with 77 guns and howitzers, and during the battle, fired over 16,000 shells, nearly half the total British supply at Cape Helen. The advance began after 2 days of bombardment, the Gurkha Rifles and Royal Fusiliers making rapid headway. Other troops, particularly the Scottish Rifles, were not so fortunate and were massacred by the Turkish machine guns. The Turkish counterattacks went on for days. In Peter Hart's words, careless of casualties, careless of anything. And for the week of the battle, the Turks themselves estimated their losses at 14,000 men, several times that of the attackers. As the counterattacks were called off, the lines stabilized. The Ottoman forces were worried about the partial success of the attackers, but they showed no signs of giving up and still held the most important high ground position. One thing, the ground in front of the British trenches was covered with a huge amount of rotting Turkish corpses. They would remain there for the rest of the campaign. Hunter Weston refused the Turkish request for a truce for mass burial. The British command thought the Turks would be less willing to attack over a no-man's land filled with their own side's corpses. Seriously. Another note from Gallipoli, on June 28th, 10 days after the arrival of a fresh Turkish regiment, Mustafa Kemal was confident he could drive the Anzac forces, the Australians and New Zealanders, off of Chunuk Bair and into the sea. He led the attack, was a failure, and his new regiment was wiped out his resignation, but was persuaded by German General Liman von Sanders to remain, since his courage is now legendary and a very real inspiration to his men, both victory and defeat. Another one of the big figures of the war was also active this week on the Western Front. German Crown Prince Wilhelm led his army to the attack in the Argonne on June 26th. The battle was fierce. It lasted for a whole week, with Wilhelm's forces eventually unable to break the French line. But one place the Germans were not being held back was on the Eastern Front. The Russians continued to retreat throughout the week as the Austro-German forces turned north and advanced between the Vistula and Bug rivers. Heavy fighting was developed between those rivers as the week ended, but still, the German colossus came on and on. Earlier in June, Kaiser Wilhelm, German Army Chief of Staff Falkenhayn, his Austrian counterpart Konrad von Hotzendorf, and German Generals Mackensen and Ludendorff had met at Pless, right? Ludendorff had requested reinforcements for his big plan, which was a big sweep of all the countries southward, cut off the Russian armies as they retreated eastward and hopefully bring the war in the east to an end. Falkenhayn, though, didn't agree to this. See, he was, like always, concerned with the security of the Western Front, and he wanted to take divisions away from Poland and bring them to France. Conrad, who had taken Italy's entry into the war against Austria as a personal insult, wanted to send troops to the Italian front. Mackensen was for continuing the hugely successful Gorlice-Tarnów offensive, and it was he who got his way, and was promoted to field marshal to boot. But now, a few weeks later, Ludendorff was still pressing the issue of his Baltic strategy. So he met the Kaiser and Falkenhayn again on June 30th at Posen with an even bigger grand plan. This one would take the German forces from the mouth of the river Niemen on the Baltic all the way to the Pripet marshes, right in the center of the whole Eastern Front. Falkenhayn did not, however, agree to Ludendorff's grand plan. He was to be allowed to have a Baltic offensive, but it was to take a backseat to Mackensen's further south. Falkenhayn was determined to not make the same mistake as Napoleon and go too far into Russia's interior. Still, the situation was pretty desperate for the Russians any way you slice it. Their whole front was destabilized, and Russian Poland was seriously vulnerable. While in East Prussia and Galicia, the German and Austro-German forces were running rampant. Finally, Grand Duke Nikolai and the Stavka, the Russian military high command, decided that even though Russia would withdraw from Galicia, she would hold on to Warsaw and Poland. Seems like it would be hard to remain optimistic, and indeed, optimism was failing everywhere. In Mesopotamia, for example, British forces were losing the optimism they had felt after their brilliant victory at Amara a few weeks ago. On June 27, British and Indian forces attacked the Ottoman garrison at Nasiriyeh, but by this time of year, the heat that had been bearable weeks ago was no longer so. It now reached 45 degrees Celsius, 115 Fahrenheit. There were hordes of mosquitoes, and the Turkish field guns there were firing as reliably as at Gallipoli. Still, the attackers managed to capture the garrison, but it was hard going. The Ottoman forces withdrew and began to prepare new defensive positions at Kut. The British and Indians tried to pursue them, but their forces were decimated by sickness, mostly sunstroke and heat stroke. I read this about a burial in Martin Gilbert's The First World War. Quote, "We started out for the cemetery, about a mile away at 6 p.m. Before we'd gone half the distance, a man went down with heat stroke and was carried back. As the corpse was lowered into the grave, one of the men on the ropes stumbled forward and fell limply into the grave on top of the dead body. And as we fell in to march back, another man went down. We had buried one man and lost 3 others over the job." End quote. And that was the week. The Germans and Austrians on the move in the east, but the Germans going nowhere in the west. The French, British, and Anzac troops all winning their engagements at Gallipoli, and the British successful in Mesopotamia, but falling to the heat. The German Galician campaign was an exercise in incredible calculation, strategy, and heroism, and it resulted in the total loss of over 1 million lives. Actually, here are some more general numbers. As of July 1st, total German casualties for the year were at 1.7 million, with 306,000 killed and 500,000 permanently disabled. And this week, the number of Frenchmen in arms reached 5 million. How many of them would die? How many would lose limbs or have their eyes burned out by gas? This was a week of new plans and battles by the Germans, and new tactics by the French and the British. But you know what? In reality, it was the same as last week, the same as every week. Thousands upon thousands of dead soldiers. All those soldiers had to live mostly in trenches, at least on the Western Front. At times, they were almost drowning in those when the rains came. Sometimes they had to eat rats. You can find out more about life in the trenches and the logistics behind them in our special episode on trench warfare right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Brian Smeets. He and the other Patreons helped us improve our maps and animations. If you want to help us reach the next milestone, check out our Patreon page. You can find more in-depth discussion on our show in our subreddit, which you should definitely check out. See you next time.
Hi, welcome to Batteries Plus Bulbs. What can I do for you today? Oh man, what happened?
Adapt or die. That's what they say, right? And it's been true so far during the war. Cavalry charges and brightly colored uniforms gave way to trenches and drab colors against the destructive power of machine gun defenses. King so far. But what happens when one side adopts the enemy's offensive strategy and refines it? Staggering success. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, we saw the Allies make headway in Gallipoli, but still failed to break through. The British were on the move in Mesopotamia, and the Austro-German forces were still pushing the Russians ever back on the Eastern Front. Here's what came next. Well, for starters, a colony fell. On July 9, 1915, German troops in German Southwest Africa unconditionally surrendered to South African General and Prime Minister Louis Botha. That might seem like an insignificant occurrence far, far from the main action, but the German troops in their colonies served to tie down the Allied colonial troops and prevent them from going to Europe to join the fight there. So Germany losing a whole colony is actually a big deal and would have long-term consequences in Europe. And there was action each and every week for the Allies in Europe, and this one was no exception. As last week's fighting in the Argonne died down, fierce fighting broke out at Arras, Souchez, and on the Meuse. It seems everyone had some small success this week. The Germans at Val-Ferry, the French recaptured positions on the heights above the Meuse, and the British captured trenches near Pilkem. However, if everyone has a success, then that simply means everyone also has a failure. Here's something else that happened in France this week that wasn't on the battlefield. On July 6th, there was an Anglo-French meeting at Calais, and French Minister of War Alexandre Millerand and British Prime Minister Herbert Asquith were the senior politicians present. All concerned were determined to make new offensives in the fall. British Commander-in-Chief John French, French General Joseph Joffre agreed the following day that this was a must. However, British Secretary of State for War Herbert Kitchener wrote scathingly of this, quote, "Joffre and Sir John told me in November that they were going to push the Germans back over the frontier. They gave me the same assurances in December, March, and May. What have they done? The attacks are costly and end in nothing," end quote. But this isn't quite true. What they had done was inspire German General August von Mackensen and his Gorlitz-Tarnov offensive. See, back in March at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, French's forces had nearly achieved a major success and broken the German line. Well, he sort of had. On a front of less than a mile, he had concentrated 300 big guns and destroyed the German trenches and barbed wire emplacements. This total overkill had opened the road to Lille for hours, and only the failures of communications and reserves to arrive to exploit the break had spoiled the best chance the Allies had yet had to penetrate the German lines. But Mackensen had adopted French's tactic and magnified it to enormous proportions and created a mobile battering ram that over the past 2 months had succeeded in the east where French had failed in the west. He had driven the Russians from the Carpathians, from Przemysl, from Lemberg, from most of Galicia, and inflicted hundreds of thousands of casualties on the retreating Russians with over 2,000 big guns. This week, though, saw a hitch in his plans. As his phalanx moved northward between the Bug and Vistula rivers, heavy fighting developed on July 5th, which saw the Austro-German forces suffer a big defeat. Mackensen's northern movement from Galicia towards the Chelm-Lublin railway line was halted. The Russians had another big success this week, also on the Eastern Front. See, Austrian Archduke Joseph Ferdinand's forces had taken Krasnik July 2nd, but 4 days later were badly beaten by the Russians, who took 15,000 Austrian prisoners. The Imperial forces were forced to withdraw, and at the end of the week, another Austrian offensive on the Zlota Lipa River was repulsed. Now, these victories were really big for the Russians, but still, Russia was by now petitioning her allies that they must provide for the rearmament of the Russian army if they wanted any new offensives to ever happen. The Russians had fewer than 100 infantry divisions, now opposed by 110 German and Austro-Hungarian ones, which were all far better armed and equipped. The Russians were also completely outgunned, although interestingly, they had the advantage in aviation units, 46 to 39. The Austrians, though, were not only taking a hit from Russia this week, but also taking one on the war's newest front, the Italian one. From the July 10th New York Times, the Italians have won a battle which had been raging for 6 days on the Corso Plateau, and they captured many Austrian positions and several thousand prisoners. Things were looking up all week for the Italians, as though they were repulsed at the bridgehead at Gorizia on the 7th, they took Monticello in Trentino the 8th, and captured Malgasarta and Costa Bella on the 9th. And further to the southeast, the Serbs occupied Durazzo in Albania on July 4th. That city was, at the time, the capital of Albania. Even further south at Gallipoli, things were fairly quiet this week after the bloody carnage of last week's action. But if we look to eastern Anatolia, the blood was still flowing. Back on June 25th, the 30,000 Armenians in Trabzon were told they had 5 days to leave the city. Well, it turned out they had 12 days. On July 7th, the slaughter in Trabzon begins. In 16 days, 15,000 Armenians there were killed by Turkish troops. Also, near the end of June, Armenians in Erzurum were ordered by decree to leave for Syria. But on June 30th, 3,000 of them are killed while leaving. On July 1st, the Governor General of Sivas announced that the Armenians there will be deported in groups according to their addresses by July 5th. A total of 48,000 people are deported. And also on July 5th, 2,000 Armenian soldiers working in labor camps at Diyarbakir are killed. But it wasn't just internal issues this week for the Ottoman Empire. As far to the south, they were on the move. Turk and Arab forces attacked Lahey in Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea on the 4th and managed to put part of it to the torch, but the British forces successfully defended it and the attackers withdrew the following day. The Sultan of Lahey actually would die from wounds received several days later. And as long as I'm talking about sultans, on the 9th, a bomb was thrown at the Sultan of Egypt. It was ineffective. And a couple more notes to round out the week. The number of Canadian conscripts was to increase to 150,000, and on the 9th, the export of gold from France was prohibited. And that was the week. Everyone, both gaining and losing in the West. The Russians finally halting Mackenson's Colossus and thrashing the Austrians, but still in dire need of assistance. The Italians beating the Austrians on their front, the British holding off the Turks and Arabs, and the Armenians being killed and deported in ever larger numbers. So Mackensen is halted for the moment. But see what he had accomplished using French's tactic of concentrated artillery barrages, always on a narrow front, straight ahead at the enemy center. The effect was pretty obvious. To the right and to the left, the Russians stood firm and even sometimes took the offensive, but they just could not concentrate anything close to enough to meet the main thrust. And their lines fell again and again and again. Each time they fell, the phalanx pushed through and opened a new hole, which would force the Russians to reorganize their whole front to conform to the retreat of those broken by the phalanx. So while the Russian troops to the north or the south would win victories of considerable magnitude, like the one over the Austrians this week, and take tens of thousands of Austrian or German prisoners, every success was faced with the fact Mackensen had broken another barrier and they had to retire yet again. So to answer my question, what happens when one side adopts the enemy's offensive strategy and refines it? What happens is a casualty toll in the millions, the bloody fact of modern war. But what other choice did the generals have? When they used their pre-war tactics against machine guns early in the war, the result was carnage on an unimagined scale. Well, unimagined at that point at least. You can find out more about that in one of our early episodes from August 21st, 1914, right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Larry Stevenson. If you want to meet your favorite History Channel crew out in the historic battlefields of World War I, help us reach our milestones on Patreon. And if you like our show, tell everyone you know about it. Twice. See you next time. The German offensive of the past 10 weeks had erased all of the Russian gains of the war, reinvigorated the Austro-Hungarian army, and put the Russians into full retreat week after week. What more could go wrong for Russia? Well, how about this? This week, Germany launches a new offensive. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, German Southwest Africa unconditionally surrendered the entire colony to South African forces. The Russians had finally halted General Mackensen's colossal force for a while, and had also dealt the Austro-Hungarian imperial forces a nasty defeat. The British had successfully defended Lahey at the mouth of the Red Sea, while on the Black Sea coast in Trabzon, the Armenian genocide continued. I'm going to start off with some numbers today, since this is going to be kind of a technical episode. The Germans announced that for the month of June, last month, In the Eastern Theater from the Baltic to the Pilitsa, they'd taken 25,595 Russian prisoners. And in the Southeastern Theater from the Pilitsa to Bukovina, 140,650. The Austro-Hungarian General Staff reported taking 194,000 prisoners during that same period. So that's a total of 360,245 Russian prisoners taken in 1 month. Of these men, 1,051 were officers. They also took 180 big guns and 684 machine guns. Russia was in big trouble. In fact, on the 16th, in Petrograd, the new Russian Minister of War, Alexei Polivanov, declared at a meeting of the Council of Ministers, "I consider it my duty to declare to the Council that the country is in danger. Where our retreat will end, only God knows." I want to look at the disposition of the Russian troops now, since we haven't really done that and it might get confusing at times. They look like this. The Russian 5th Army under General Plebe held the line from Riga to Kovno. The 10th Army under General Radkovich from Kovno to Osovets. The 12th Army, led by General Churin and including Siberian Corps, from Osovets to the Orsits River. From there, General Livanov held the line down to the lower Vistula River, and from there, the 2nd Army under General Smirnov in Warsaw held it to Guru Kalvaria. General Evert, stationed at Ivangorod, held the front with the 4th Army from northwest of the city to about 16 kilometers south of Lublin. The 3rd Army under General Lesh held it from there to south of Kelm. The 13th Army under General Gorbachevsky from there to Vladimir Volinsk. General Brusilov and his 8th Army held the line from northeast of Sokal to west of Solochiv. The 11th Army under General Sherbachev from there to Nizhnev. And finally, the Russian 9th Army under General Lechitsky from there to Kotin. That is one hell of a front line, and it was going to get messy. This week, on July 14th, a great German offensive designed to go all the way from the Baltic down to Bukovina begins. The Germans moved toward Riga, one group toward Kovno, and another towards Shalvil. Now, one thing to remember here is that the Austro-German troops further south, who had been fighting the Gorlitsa-Tarnov offensive since May 1st and taking huge amounts of territory from the Russians, had been halted last week. They took some time to recuperate and were back in action this week. In the south, the Austrians crossed the Dniester River in Bukovina. Further north, the Russians fell back in Poland towards the Narev River as on July 15th, the Germans announced the occupation of the city of Chasnitz. Over 20,000 more Russian prisoners were taken in a few days. As for General Mackensen, the man behind Gorlitsa-Tarnov, his phalanx was also moving on, taking Krasnostav at the end of the week with 6,370 prisoners. It's amazing the amount of ground the Central Powers had taken or retaken this summer. But if we look further south to Gallipoli, we see one offensive still going nowhere. There had been plenty of action in June and July at Cape Helles, and this week, British General Aylmer Hunter Weston and his French counterpart Henri Gouraud were going to try again. This time, the British would attack the Achibaba Nola sector, supported by both British and French artillery. Meanwhile, combined French and British troops were going to try to take the Turkish trenches that remained on the western bank of Kereves Dere. One attack to begin at 7:30 a.m., the other just before 5 p.m. So, the first attack began after a preliminary artillery barrage, and as the French and British secured the first of two lines of Turkish trenches, confusion began to descend. It was because what looked like the third trench line, the final objective, turned out to be only about 2 feet deep and undiggable, so they eventually had to retire since there was hardly any cover. The second attack still went off as planned, and it followed exactly the same pattern. Artillery barrage, bloody attack against resistance, confusion when the third trench again turned out not to be a third trench, and then eventually a retreat and a consolidation at the second trench line. The next day saw more attacks and violent counterattacks, and the Turks would take a total of nearly 10,000 casualties, far more than the Allies. But they could easily bring up reserves, so you have to realize that at this rate of taking territory, it would take the Allies years to actually take Achibaba or Kilit Bar, two major goals. Here's Major General Granville Egerton's assessment of the events of July 12th and 13th. The fighting of this battle was premature, and at the actual moment, worse than unnecessary. I submit that it was cruel and wasteful. The troops were tired and worn out. It was well known to the higher command that large reinforcements were arriving from England. Was it not therefore obvious that the exhausted garrison at Helles should be given a fortnight's respite? If the conception of the battle was wrong, the tactics of the action were worse. The division of the attack was positively wicked. It was quite simply a waste of lives. Even General Hunter Weston himself wouldn't be there for much longer, actually. He began to suffer the effects of heat stroke and was evacuated home soon after. He may have had serious flaws as a general, but really, the overall responsibility for the doomed and pointless attacks at Helles in June and July lay with the man in overall command, General Sir Ian Hamilton. Here's a little side note that tells you what the men thought of the attacks. Twice, during July, British forces refused to advance at Gallipoli. But this week, the British had indeed taken 2 trench lines, but at a cost of thousands of men. That couldn't realistically continue. It was a stalemate, and not the only one, as the endless stalemate of the Western Front continued. Up in Belgium, the Germans attacked on the Yser Canal, taking heavy losses and failing again to capture the left bank. At the other end of the front, Kaiser Wilhelm's son, Crown Prince Wilhelm's forces were again stopped in the Argonne, but a new attack captures the French line at Vienne-la-Château and the heights of La Ville-Morte. Here are a few notes to round out the week. Venice was bombed for the 4th time by Austrian airplanes on the 11th. On the 14th, Montenegrins hold off an Austrian attack at Grahovo, and on the 11th, the Turkish Interior Ministry instructs the depopulated Armenian villages be settled with Muslim immigrants. Also this week, the German government took control of the German coal industry, and in Britain, the National Registration Bill passed the House of Lords. And that was the week. The Germans beginning a new offensive in the north, while they and their allies mercilessly continue an old one in the south. The British, French, and Turks losing thousands of men basically for nothing at Gallipoli. The Belgians holding off the Germans, but the French not faring quite so well. But however bad things were at Gallipoli, they were nothing compared to what was happening to the Russians. I mean, not just losing close to 400,000 troops as prisoners in a month, and that's not the dead or wounded. Russian casualties had topped 1 million in early 1915. Just the officer losses by the end of 1914 were greater than the number of total officers at the beginning of the war. One source says 50% more. Who was going to replace them? Who was going to lead or inspire the troops? Promotion from within the ranks was often counterproductive, since over half the troops were illiterate. Many at home who had the education got deferments. There were even fewer non-commissioned officers. The desperate need for replacement troops meant that loads of new soldiers arrived after 2 or 3 weeks of training without weapons. And all of those prisoners being taken by the enemy meant vital equipment being taken by the enemy that was not replaced. Russia had millions of men and almost endless land, but would that be enough? And how many millions of men must be lost before the Germans and Austrians could be stopped? And with Germany launching a new, ambitious offensive, it would only get worse. By this point in the war, we were now looking at death and destruction on a scale never before imagined. But don't get the wrong picture here. The Russians were certainly not incapable of anything. Just in February, the Austrians were afraid the Russians were going to invade their homeland. Who knew that the Russians were better prepared for mountain warfare in winter? You can check out how that went in our episode from week 29 right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Matthew Hartshorn. Thank you, Matthew. If you want to help our show to produce more awesome specials, support us on Patreon. And for a glimpse behind the scenes of our show, you can join our ever-growing Facebook community. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Russia had been in retreat from the German and Austro-Hungarian armies for nearly 3 months, losing huge areas of land and hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But what could she do to prevent the invaders from making use of their gains? Well, Russia adopted a scorched earth policy. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. The big news last week was a new German offensive that was designed to sweep from the Baltic down to Bukovina. The ongoing Gorlice-Tarnov offensive was gaining new ground further south. The British and French made small gains at Gallipoli, but at a big cost in men. The stalemate continued in the west as the Germans again failed to cross the Yser Canal. Here's what happened next. the German phalanx under General August von Mackensen moved inexorably onward. There was heavy fighting this week between the Bug and Vistula rivers, but the Russians still stubbornly defended the Lublin-Kelm railway line, even as they retreated along their entire line. Things were really looking grim over in the Polish salient, where the Germans attacked both north and south of Warsaw on the 19th. The Germans also stormed the fortresses of Rochan and Pultus and crossed the Narew River. But as the Germans advanced in Poland, a lot of people weren't sticking around to see how things would turn out. The Russian High Command received reports of large-scale, systematic depopulation of the Plotzk district, northwest of Warsaw, where Russian units had uprooted 22,000 of 25,000 inhabitants and torched their villages in a scorched earth policy. Actually, all Russian-controlled areas subject to the threat of invasion came under military administration. And the principal thought concerning Nikolai Yanushkevich, chief of the General Staff, was to scorch the earth and leave the invaders nothing but wilderness. Thing is, the effect of this was really terrible for industry in any cities under threat, as Warsaw was now, for example. But think of the effect on the civilian population. Peter Gatrell's book about Russian refugees during the war has this first-person experience. We were forced to burn our homes and crops. We weren't allowed to take our cattle with us. We weren't even allowed to return to our homes to get some money. By the end of 1915, yeah, I know it's jumping ahead, by the end of 1915, there would be 3.3 million refugees in Russia. You had families that ran successful farms who were totally impoverished. Industrial cities would lose their entire workforce. In Warsaw, the whole population was eventually told to leave because it was worried that the Poles really supported Austria-Hungary. Refugees also carried disease like typhus or cholera, and since they now had nothing, they would often have to resort to looting just to survive. So the army, on its great retreat, while admittedly leaving little of use for the Germans or Austrians, was making things a lot more difficult for itself, particularly clogging what was already a totally inadequate system of transportation. To make things even worse, Yanushkevich was so anti-Semitic that it pissed off the Russian public opinion. And considering the thousands of Jews killed in Russia during the pogroms of the last couple of decades, that's pretty serious. So certain areas were cleansed of supposedly unreliable elements, like those of German ancestry or Jews. Having said that, there was a positive side for Russian Jews as well. Until mid-1915, they had been mostly limited to living in cities and towns in the Pale of Settlement since the time of Catherine the Great 120 years earlier. But the Pale would soon be abolished as the Great Exodus continued, and Jews would be allowed to relocate further east and also to settle in the countryside instead of only the towns. I mentioned disease briefly, and now I'm going to talk about it a little more deeply, but far to the south, at Gallipoli. This week at Gallipoli was fairly quiet compared to all the action so far in June and July. But here's something that I haven't talked about there yet: sanitation. Now, corpses were left to rot in no man's land at Gallipoli since the whole area was covered by fire. And with the rotting corpses and the summer heat came the flies. Millions of flies. These were more than just an irritation because they were feeding on the liquid feces that filled the open latrines. Peter Hart says that one medical handbook claims one female fly could originate nearly 5,600,000,000 flies in 6 months. So when I say millions of flies, I mean millions of flies. Now, latrine discipline was theoretically of major importance, and all latrines were to be covered and fly-proof. But, you know, this wasn't a camp. It was a battlefield, and the whole place was, again, under fire. So there was neither the wood, the space, the disinfectants, or even the time to begin to cope with sanitary issues. Toilet paper was a highly prized luxury, and hygiene, by this time, was pretty much non-existent. So the millions of flies carried a cocktail of infections, such as dysentery. Thousands of men suffered intense abdominal pain, and a lot of them didn't even have the strength to make it to the latrines, which only made things worse. Water shortages made dehydration a huge issue too. Paratyphoid came with the dysentery, so a lot of men suffered from both, and symptoms included, but were not limited to, fever, headache, stomachache, vomiting, shivering fits, bronchial coughs, diarrhea, vertigo, deafness, aching joints, and rashes. And if you managed to avoid getting sick, you still had to deal with the lice, which affected pretty much everyone. At least on the Western Front, there were delousing centers. There was no such luxury at Gallipoli. One other common problem was soldier's heart, which is when you'd become so weak from disease that some of your bodily functions would begin shutting down, and you would be totally breathless after even the slightest exertion. The strength of the troops was literally wasting away. And in the British House of Commons on the 19th, total Dardanelles casualties through June 30th were announced as 42,344. And the stalemate there continued. And another front that seemed to also be turning into stalemate was the newest one, the Italian front. Now, the Italians had actually made some small advances against the numerically inferior Austro-Hungarian defenses. But by this week, which saw the Second Battle of the Isonzo, you could pretty well see the emerging pattern. The Italians used simple frontal attacks, relying on force of numbers and courage to carry the day over the Austrians. And in this, they were to be disappointed again and again and again. Italian Army Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna was completely inflexible and seemingly without imagination, but he had unshakable self-confidence and learned nothing from repeated setbacks when he used the same tactics over and over. He even believed that the failures were only caused by a lack of determination by his men. Thing is, though he had managed to scrape together any and all guns from all over Italy, there was nowhere near enough guns, gunners, or shells to take out the Austrian strongpoints. So even when managing to take somewhere like Mont Saint-Michel, which his troops took the 19th after bloody fighting, they would just lose it to counterattacks. There was also foreshadowing this week with what could possibly become yet another front. On July 17th, a secret treaty was signed between the three Central Powers and Bulgaria, under which Bulgaria would get 600 square miles of Turkish territory in Thrace. The next day, the German ambassador at Constantinople was received in Bulgaria's capital, Sofia. However, the day after that, Bulgaria once again publicly declared her neutrality. And here are some notes to round out the week. The Serbs evacuated the Albanian capital of Durazzo by Italian request the 17th. On the 22nd, 30 Turkish officers with a cargo of arms sailed for Tripoli, which was controlled by Italy in a hostile Libya. Many Italians would demand war against the Ottoman Empire for this blatant attempt to arm rebels. So, another week, the 51st of the war ends, with the Russians still in retreat, still losing thousands of prisoners and destroying their own territory to confound the attackers. The Western Front was quiet, but that just meant thousands of casualties instead of tens of thousands of casualties. Gallipoli too was quiet, but the nightmare there continued while the Italians tangled once again with Austria. So the Russians were scorching the earth. Perhaps it was essential, for if places like Warsaw were to fall, with all of their factories, railway lines, and military equipment, what a huge boon that would be for the conquerors. But still, what a man-made hell it was for the civilians, the refugees who numbered in the millions. Imagine that. Say you have a farm in Poland. You're too old to fight, but your sons go to war. Perhaps one or more even survive the first year. And then you, your family, in spite of doing your patriotic duty, are ordered to leave your home, your possessions, your dignity, and relocate God knows where and God knows how, maybe turning to crime to survive and being jailed or killed in consequence. Tragedies of this war are never ending. And the tragedies were everywhere. Sure, the men in the trenches were fighting and dying for whatever reason the generals just came up with, but the women at home had their burden to carry too. And we made a special episode about the role of women in the First World War, which you can check out right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Matthew Fritz. Thank you, Matthew. Help us reach our milestones on Patreon so that we can start to shoot on the original locations of the First World War. And follow us on Instagram for more facts and pictures from World War I. And don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. This war, which was supposed to be over by last Christmas, celebrates its first birthday this week. In just 12 months, we've seen the advent of weapons of horror like the flamethrower and poison gas. We've seen submarines intentionally torpedo civilians, and we've seen new fronts spring up pretty much every month. And now it seems the people at home have had enough. for there were stirrings of revolution in the air. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week in Poland, the Germans beat back the Russians on two sides of Warsaw, and the Great Russian Retreat, both there and between the Bug and Vistula rivers, had led to a scorched earth policy that would create millions of refugees. The Western Front was static. The Italians tried again and failed to break through the Austrian lines at the Isonzo River, and at Gallipoli, disease was becoming a major issue. Something that also happened last week, but was happening every week, was the ongoing Armenian genocide in eastern Anatolia. Now, on the 27th, the Ottoman Imperial Army forced the Russians back near Mush. But Mush had been in the headlines all month, since throughout the month, thousands of Armenians had been massacred in the region. But though news of these massacres caused great indignation among the Allies, it was becoming obvious by now that all restraints were easing on all sides. For Britain was preparing to use poison gas in its next offensive, and the Kaiser took back his earlier orders not to bomb residential areas of London. As impossible as it seems, the war was getting even uglier. Look at what was happening on the Western Front this week, and you'll see it even more. One of the micro battles that basically happened every day on the stalemate of the Western Front was this week at Hooge. This was a battle for a mine crater, which had been created during an earlier British assault on the German trenches. Now, mine craters were big prizes because they gave shelter to whoever captured them, and a pretty well-protected place from which to fire on the enemy. The attack began on the 29th, and the Germans used their heavy mortar shells, the Minenwerfer, later known as the Minis by the British. These shells not only blew people to pieces, but the power of the explosions was so terrific that several men of the attacking battalion were sent back behind the lines in a state of gibbering helplessness. Well, that was on the 29th. On the 30th, the Germans used flamethrowers on the British. Way back in February, the Germans had experimented with flamethrowers in battle, though ineffectively. But at Hooge, the burning jets of gasoline were devastating. Lieutenant G.V. Carey wrote, "There was a sudden hissing sound, and a bright crimson glare over the crater turned the whole scene red. As I looked, I saw 3 or 4 jets of flame, like a line of powerful fire hoses, spraying fire instead of water, shoot across my fire trench. The men caught in the blast of the fire were never seen again." That was the morning attack. In the afternoon, the British attacked again, going over the top at 3 o'clock and being cut to pieces by the machine guns that they hadn't had time to locate. It was a complete, agonizing failure, and all for a hole in the ground. But while the action in the west might be micro, it was certainly macro in the east. In fear of possible invasion, Russia evacuated the factories in both Riga and Warsaw on the 25th. On the 27th, Warsaw was attacked on 3 sides. On the 28th, the German army crossed the Vistula between Warsaw and Ivangorod. On the 29th, the Lublin-Kelm railway, vital for the Russians, was finally cut by Austro-German forces. And on the 30th, the Russians fell back along the entire line as the evacuation of Warsaw continued and the Austro-Hungarian army occupied Lublin. The Russians had steadily been losing territory for 3 solid months since German General August von Mackensen kicked off the Gorlice-Tarnov offensive, and now that a second offensive was beginning far to the north, it seemed like it would only get worse. And just imagine the effect it had on the morale of the hopelessly outgunned and out-equipped soldiers. There were certainly those willing to step in and take advantage of the situation. This week, the Russian General Staff gave out to all Russian commanders a secret report about Bolshevik anti-war propaganda that was apparently being hidden in gifts sent from home. At this point, one Russian report says that superhuman efforts were required to keep the men in their trenches. And on the 30th, in Petrograd, General Poplivanov, the new Minister of War, warned that demoralization, surrender, and desertion are assuming huge proportions. Actually, on the 27th, James W. Gerard, the American ambassador in Berlin, told Washington that Germans were picking out the revolutionists and liberals from the many Russian prisoners of war, furnishing them with money and false passports and papers, sending them back to Russia to stir up a revolution. But the idea of governmental change was not only Russian. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey had even said back on the 15th, the continuation of the war must result in the overthrow of all existing forms of government. That's the Foreign Secretary saying that. And this week in Berlin, the new Fatherland League supported a declaration by 91 German intellectuals, including Albert Einstein, that pushed for a compromise peace with no annexed territories. When the League then did a mail-out of an anthology of statements by British pacifists like George Bernard Shaw and Bertrand Russell, the League's offices were raided and it was forced to cease all publications. Eventually, the League's existence was banned. But you could see the huge discontent that was spreading in the countries that had been at war the longest. This wasn't quite the case with Italy, though, who had only been at war for a couple of months and hadn't yet had time to suffer 1 million casualties or so. This week went well for the Italians as they advanced on the Lower Isonzo the 25th, occupied crests in the Julian Alps the 26th, captured the island of Pelagosa in the Adriatic that same day. At the end of the week, were making offensives in the Venetian Alps and Trentino. And in the Adriatic this week, the French destroyed an Austrian submarine supply station at Lagosta. It was an active week for subs. The American steamer Leelanau was torpedoed the 25th. This was a cargo ship, and there were fortunately no casualties, but on the 30th, the Leyland liner Iberia was torpedoed, and an American citizen was killed. But since it had disregarded an order to stop and had tried to escape, the American State Department said it would take no action. And here are a few notes to round out the week. On the 25th, South Africa officially annexed German Southwest Africa. That same day in the Middle East, Nasiriyah was shelled, attacked, and occupied by British forces under General Göring. And the following day, Nave announced its independence from the Ottoman Empire and put the garrison there to flight. And at the end of the week, 45 French planes bombed Freiburg and Pfalzburg as the war in the air continues to grow. So that's what was happening. The Germans closing in on Warsaw and Ivangorod as the Russians evacuate. The British being stopped from taking a hole in the ground by flamethrowers and high explosives. The Italians on the move and revolution in the air. But it had to come to that, right? Dreams of revolution, especially for Russia, who had already had one revolution in the past decade. Think, if you were in that army, an educated officer, watching hundreds of thousands of your comrades throw themselves against Austrian and German artillery, again and again, armed only with bayonets or clubs, the lucky ones having a rifle. And all for what? Why were you fighting the Germans again? Because a Serb shot an Austrian a year ago? Did that make any sense to you? Did you still support your government, your absolute ruler who sent you to fight? More and more often, the answer was no, as despair grew and grew. The war was exactly a year old, with no end in sight. You were reduced to torching your own country just to survive, and all you had left were your dreams of a future where you finally had control of your own destiny. Happy birthday, Great War. If you're new to our show or want to catch up on the events of the past 12 months, you can watch our playlist of special recap episodes right here. Now, 12 months of the war, of course, means that our channel and our show also celebrate their birthday with this episode. We've come a long way, and we could not have done it without you all, so thank you very much for your ongoing support. You guys are an awesome community. I love the comments. As somebody wrote, this is the only channel on YouTube where the comments don't suck, and that might not be entirely true, but I love the comments from you guys. I love that we're making this fantastic interactive documentary, and I'm really looking forward to the next 12 months with you all. You guys want to come here and say thank you to everybody? Guys, longer we're doing this episode.
Thank you.
Okay, Tony,
Thank you.
Flo, David.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.
Don't forget to subscribe and tell all your friends about us. We'll see you, well, for a long time coming. All right, see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Russia had been steadily losing territory for over 3 months now, and 6 weeks ago even lost Lemberg, the capital of Galicia. But this week, it gets even worse. For this week, the Germans take Warsaw. I'm Indy Nidell. This is The Great War. Last week, the war celebrated its first birthday in a previously unheard of manner. On the Western Front, the Germans used flamethrowers effectively for the first time at Hughe. The Armenian genocide continued in eastern Anatolia, and at sea, more ships carrying civilians were torpedoed. On the Eastern Front, the Russians ended the week retreating along their entire line, as they also evacuated Warsaw and Riga from advancing German armies. And at home in Petrograd, there was a very real fear of what was to become of the army as desertion, surrender, and revolutionary propaganda became epidemic in the field. Italy was on the move, and way away to the south, South Africa annexed the former German colony of Southwest Africa. We're going to look at Russia first today, specifically what was going on in the Polish salient, where the Germans and Austrians had been tightening the noose for weeks. The Russian fortress of Ivangorod, besieged throughout the week from all sides, could hold out no longer and was abandoned. Austrian forces triumphantly entered August 4th. The Russian retreat from Warsaw, which had been nearly surrounded by this time, began the night of August 3rd, though the city had already been stripped of things like medals from church bells and usable machinery. The Germans arrived on August 5th at 6 a.m. as Prince Leopold of Bavaria formally took command of the city. This was an enormous prize. The Russians were without control of the city for the first time in 100 years, and the Germans now set their long-term sights towards Finland, which had belonged to Russia since 1808, when Russia had taken it from Sweden. The fall of Warsaw was a big blow for Russia, and the war was in motion this week on the whole Eastern Front, and way to the south at Gallipoli, men were trying to get that front into motion again and break the stalemate. This week, British forces would try yet again to break through and launched an attack at Suvla Bay. The goal was to link up with Anzac, Australian and New Zealander, positions further south and finally drive the Turks off the high ground at Chunuk Bair and the even higher Koja Chemen Tepe. Now, there were two diversionary attacks planned to draw Turkish forces away from the high ground. The first was above Anzac Cove at Lone Pine, and the Australians managed to penetrate the Turkish lines in a bloodbath. When they consolidated the newly taken trenches, over 1,000 Turkish bodies had to be carried out of them, and there were another 4,000 Turkish casualties. The Australians took only 1,700. The second diversion was at Cape Helles, once again, for the umpteenth time, trying to take the village of Krithia and the heights of Akibaba. This attack was not as successful as the first, but both of these were successful as diversions, as Australian, New Zealander, Indian, and British troops successfully landed at Suvla Bay, overcame the defenders, crossed the coastal plain, headed towards the hills, and then stopped. See, these men were by now used to Western Front victories of 50 or 100 yards. Now that they had a half mile of unopposed advance in front of them, they didn't really know what to do. So they hesitated and failed to advance. That night, further south, 16,000 Australian troops headed northward from Anzac Cove to take Koja Chemen Tepe. Now, at Koja Chemen Tepe was Colonel Hans Kanengieser, but he had just gotten there. He had initially gone to Lone Pine with a Turkish division, but since he missed the action there, he headed for the high ground. So he got to see, by the dawn's early light, a huge column of 16,000 Australians advancing 300 yards below. Kanengieser only had 20 men with him, so he ordered them to lie down and open fire. The Australians thought they were facing a much bigger force, so they too lay down and took cover, and by the time the deception was realized, General Lehman von Sanders had arrived at the summit with 2 Ottoman regiments, and the Turks held the heights. Further south, a New Zealand battalion had reached the top of Chunuk Bair with no opposition. At the top, they found 1 Turkish machine gun and its sleeping crew. But Turkish troops on spurs on each side of Chunuk Bair, on Hill Q and Battleship Hill, opened fire on the New Zealanders and prevented reinforcements from arriving. And that's how things stood there at the end of the week. A little Gallipoli side note here. On August 1st, the Galata Bridge in Constantinople was blown up by British subs. British technology was certainly improving, but if you look around Europe, it was the Germans whose innovations were the big things. Their U-boats were feared by all shipping. Their poison gas was the terror of troops on the Western Front, their artillery on the Eastern one. They had just begun using flamethrowers successfully, which added yet another element of terror to their arsenal. And now, as of the beginning of August 1915, they ruled the skies as the Fokker scourge began. The Fokker Eindecker were single-seat fighter planes developed by Dutchman Anthony Fokker. They were not only the first German fighter planes built, they were the first of all planes outfitted with synchronization gear, which allowed the pilot to fire his machine gun through the propeller, so he could aim the gun just by aiming the plane. This was a major innovation. Fokker demonstrated the plane back on May 23rd, and now, as the summer dragged on, with planes in the hands of Oswald Belke and Max Immelmann, Germany unquestionably had the flying advantage. The Allied aviators even soon began to refer to their own planes as Fokker fodder. The Fokker Scourge also really marked the beginning of the age of the flying aces. And though the Germans enjoyed a tactical advantage, they also had a huge psychological one. By the end of July, there were only around 15 Eindeckers in service, but that number would soon grow. One acute issue that Germany did have that occasionally limited just what could be produced was raw materials. Imports from overseas were of course cut off by the blockade, but way back at the beginning of the war, August 9, 1914, Walter Rathenau, a Jewish businessman, persuaded Erich von Falkenhayn, now German Army Chief of Staff, but at that time Minister of War, to establish a raw materials agency. Its first task was to take stock of raw materials not only within Germany, but also in occupied territories, especially Belgium, so they could then be centrally allocated to the companies that could make the best use of them. So, each commodity had its own raw materials company, and that company had a board made up primarily from the companies that used that commodity. So whether or not the agency was successful, there were charges that the free market had been enlisted to serve the government, but with guaranteed profits. Here's the thing. A dramatic expansion of output and a shift to making things as quickly as possible had the big consequence of lowering standards a whole lot. Germany, for example, lost 2,300 field guns and 900 howitzers in 1915 because of premature explosions. That's the same amount that were disabled by enemy action. So expansion had taken over from quality control. Just thought I'd touch on the subject as long as I was talking about German technology. And so another week comes to an end, with the British troops looking surprisingly good at Gallipoli and a mostly quiet Western Front, so Germany took control of the skies. But the Eastern Front was in total upheaval as the Austro-German forces took Ivangorod and Warsaw. But what did that mean for Russia? Well, it was a big deal, but Warsaw had been right near enemy territory since the beginning of the war, so it had always been conceivable that it would fall. But there was something else brewing that, if it happened, would have far greater consequences in Petrograd. The German offensive up in the Baltic was something really scary, for it threatened Kovno, also called Kaunas, which was in Russian Lithuania, and meant more to a Russian patriot than Polish territory did. But more than that, it was one of the strongest and greatest of the Russian fortresses and held an enormous amount of weapons, ammunition, and all kinds of provisions. Some of the advanced forts had fallen into German hands in July, and by the end of this week, it was under siege. And so we just keep seeing each week that things go worse and worse for the Russians, fighting and dying by the anonymous hundreds of thousands as their territory slips from their grasp. This was modern war. Today we talked about German weapons that seemed to be unstoppable at this point of the war. Especially notorious was the gas used on the Western Front. Now, it was based on the research of one man, Fritz Haber. He played a major role in creating gas warfare, but also won a Nobel Prize after the war. You can find out how all that happened in our special episode about Fritz Haber right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Bernie Stern. Thank you, Bernie. If you want to find out more about supporting this show and get cool perks in return, check out our Patreon page. For more discussions on the show, check out our subreddit. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. The battle at Gallipoli had been a stalemate for months, but the Allies had landed tens of thousands of troops last week in a fresh attempt to gain the high ground. But what happens when new recruits who've never seen battle take on a battle-hardened enemy? You'll find out in just a minute. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, Warsaw, the capital of Russian Poland, had finally fallen to the German juggernaut after its evacuation. The Germans now had the Russian fortress of Kovno, or Kaunas, under siege in Russian Lithuania. At Gallipoli, the British had made a successful landing at Suvla Bay, but had only advanced a short way across the plain before halting, while New Zealander troops finally held the high ground of Chunuk Bair, and the new synchronization gear developed by Anthony Fokker for the Germans that allowed a machine gun to fire between propeller blades gave the Germans mastery of the skies. That was over on the Western Front at the moment, and I'll take a look there first this week. On August 7th, the Germans attacked in the Argonne and the Bosch, but were knocked back with casualties estimated at around 4,000. Twice more they would try this week to break through in the Argonne, failing both times. Also in the West, Zeppelin raids on the east coast of Britain the 9th and 13th claimed 29 civilian lives. Still, the civilians in Britain had it far better than those in Eastern Europe, many of whom were in full flight, destroying their property and burning their farms as they fled from the German Colossus. The German army that took Warsaw advanced eastward, and the Russian army fell back, leaving as defense the fortress of Novo-Georgievsk with 90,000 men as the garrison. This was where the Vistula and Bug rivers come together, but it didn't slow the German advance at all. They surrounded it and set siege to it, but continued on, leaving 80,000 non-frontline soldiers as the siege troops, and beginning to bring in the big howitzers, the 16-inch guns that had demolished Antwerp last fall. The same commander from that siege, General Hans-Hartwig von Bessler. There was a lot of German and Russian action far to the north, as the Germans made moves toward both Riga and Kovno. Twice this week, the German Navy bombarded Riga, but were driven off both times, while on the 7th, near Riga itself, the Russians pushed back the Germans. At Kovno, German artillery began bombarding the forts on the 8th with the great Gamma Gerat howitzer, whose shells weighed a ton and had a range of 14 kilometers. But the Russians fought off several attempts to break through the perimeter, inflicting severe casualties on the Germans. On the 9th, the Germans tried a night attack, but lost a full 3 battalions to the Russian counterattack. Just a side note here, the German artillery bombardment was so fantastic that it could apparently be heard as far away as Vilnius, 100 kilometers away. Even though the Russian counterattacks were effective at the beginning of the week, by the end of it, both Vilnius and Kovno were being evacuated, though the Germans still could not break through. But the artillery was wreaking havoc on the forts defending. Back at home in Berlin, the Kaiser this week authorized a battalion of 2,000 men that would be entirely Finns to fight against Russia. The recruits were to be smuggled out of Finland, which had loads of Russian police, so everything was done in total secrecy. One other thing that happened this week involving Germany. At the end of the week, Austro-Hungarian and German armies made contact west of Brest-Litovsk. They now formed an unbroken line encircling 3 Russian armies, and probably foreshadowing yet another disaster for the Russians. And one of the greatest disasters of the war, Gallipoli, continued this week with fresh attacks. On August 9th, the attack on Koja Chementepe was renewed. British and Gurkha forces actually reached the top and fought off the Turkish counterattack with a bayonet charge. They were even about to drive the Turks down the far side when British naval gunners, unaware of their success, fired upon them and forced them back. The New Zealand forces that had held Chunuk Bair for a couple of days now faced an attack by Turkish forces commanded by Mustafa Kemal. They counterattacked brilliantly and had the Turks in disarray. Kemal's staff wanted to retreat, but the recently promoted Kemal, now a colonel and awarded the Iron Cross First Class by the Germans, said this: "Don't rush it, my sons. Don't be in a hurry. We will choose exactly the right minute. Then I shall go out in front. When you see me raise my hand, look to it that you have your bayonets sharp and fixed, and come out after me." Meanwhile, the New Zealanders had finally been relieved by 2 battalions from Lord Kitchener's new army who had never seen action: the 6th Loyal North Lancashires and the 5th Wiltshires. On the morning of August 10th, at 4:45 a.m., Mustafa Kemal raised his hand and walked forward. His now 6 Turkish battalions charged the Lancashires and bayoneted them to the man. And in an incredible stroke of bad luck for the British, the Wiltshires below had just put down their rifles to rest and could only helplessly run away. So the Turks charged down the slope, hoping to force the Allies completely from the hill. But New Zealand machine gunners on the next spur opened fire and stopped the Turkish left flank. The right flank reached a plateau called the Farm, where they met the 38th Brigade. Hand-in-hand fighting broke out, and after half of the brigade had been killed or wounded, including Brigadier General A.H. Baldwin, the survivors on both sides fell back. The British further downhill, and the Turks up on the ridge. Once again, Chunuk Bair was in Turkish hands. The Allied lines were further inland than before, yes, but still stuck on the western side of the peninsula. Just think, for a short while, those New Zealander troops that had held the top of Chunuk Bair could actually see the waters of the Narrows shimmering and glistening below them. The target, the main goal. Perhaps one day they'd see them again. At Suvla Bay, where British troops had successfully landed last week, there were several days of fighting early this week. British battalions were ashore by the 7th, and German Admiral von Tirpitz wrote this day in his diary: Heavy fighting has been going on since yesterday at the Dardanelles. The situation is obviously critical. Should the Dardanelles fall, the World War has been decided against us. Now, as we saw last week, the troops that landed didn't advance across the coastal plain towards Akibaba, and this hesitation would prove disastrous over the next few days. British official historian Brigadier General Aspinall Oglander, there's a mouthful, was harsh on them. Quote, "By the hesitation and delay of the 7th and 8th of August, the advantages gained by the surprise landing at Subla had all been thrown away. It was now to be a fight between forces of equal numbers, with the British troops in the open and the Turks in possession of every point of vantage. Once surprise had gone, there was little chance with anything approaching equal numbers of scoring a British success." End quote. He also noted that the British battalions were new army troops straight out of England, and the Turks were experienced and far superior to them. So, for the total 4 days of battle for Subla Bay, Chunuk Bair, 50,000 British and Anzac troops had fought, with 10,000 killed and 2,000 wounded. But more than 20,000 sick and wounded men were taken from Gallipoli to hospitals in either Egypt or Malta. By the end of the week, the hospitals were full. And completely failing to learn from their earlier mistake, when the assault was renewed the 13th, the troops again advanced from Subla Bay, stopped, and dug a line of trenches when they reached Anafarta Ridge, even though there were no Turks or Turkish trenches anywhere in sight, and they could have continued a lot further and captured high ground. Within 24 hours, the Turkish 5th Division had driven them back toward the bay. Also on the 13th, the Allied troop transport, the Royal Edward, all 11,000 tons of her, was sunk by a German sub off the island of Kos. 1,865 soldiers drowned. And we come to the end of the week. The German and Austrian forces linking up in a solid line that spells trouble for the Russians. The Russians under siege in Kovno and Novogeorgievsk. The Germans failing in the Argonne and the Allies failing at Gallipoli. For you can't call it anything but a failure. Taking a few dozen meters of new ground isn't a success when you have entire battalions being basically wiped out. I can understand that those New Zealander troops holding Chunuk Bair desperately needed relief, and the Lancashires and Wiltshires may have been the only troops available, but those men, those raw recruits who'd never seen combat, were simply sent to the slaughter. I don't think there's any strategy that can justify that, but 2020 hindsight is easy, but 2020 foresight is absolutely impossible in modern war. And in the end, there were many people who said beforehand that taking the Dardanelles is impossible. Even Winston Churchill, who came up with the plan in late 1914, had said so a few years earlier. Still, they tried, and it didn't look good from day one. You can click here to find out how the Gallipoli landings happened a few months ago. Here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Seth Minahan. Thank you, Seth. Help us reach our goals on Patreon and get awesome perks in return. For more updates on World War I, follow us on Twitter. See you next time. The Russians had been retreating from 2 Austro-German offensives for months and had even lost Warsaw, which they had controlled since the time of Napoleon. This was a bitter pill to swallow, but not as bitter as the one this week. This week, the Russians lost the mighty fortress city of Kovno. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Germans launched Zeppelin air raids on the British coast, killing civilians. The German Navy tried to attack Riga, but was driven off by the Russians, but was bombing the crap out of Kovno with howitzers with a range of 14 kilometers. At Gallipoli, the British forces were driven from Chunuk Bair by the heroism of Turkish leader Mustafa Kemal and their own blunders, and the Western Front remained relatively quiet. Of course, relatively quiet just means relative to the other fronts. There were still attacks, counterattacks, snipers, and artillery barrages every day. Here's a story from the Western Front that I got from Martin Gilbert's The First World War that illustrates the lighter side of the war there. On August 16th, the diary of Captain F. Hitchcock notes that his trenches were inspected that day by his brigadier general, who said that the battalion had done a splendid job, but he objected to a German soldier's leg that was sticking out of the parapet. The general told Hitchcock to remove it. Hitchcock wrote, "I called Finnegan and told him to remove the offending limb. As it would have meant pulling down the whole parapet to bury it, he took up a shovel and slashed at it with the sharp edge of the tool. After some hard bangs, he managed to sever the limb. I turned away and overheard Finnegan remarking to another man, 'I want the bloody hell to hang me equipment on now.' As you can well imagine, much of the trench humor was of that black character. But there was nothing funny about the British situation on another trench-built front. At Gallipoli, on August 14th, British Secretary of State for War Lord Herbert Kitchener read General Sir Ian Hamilton's reports about last week's Allied landings at Suvla Bay and was seriously pissed off by the commander's failure to advance in the early stages of the mission and at some of the weaknesses revealed. For example, the Welsh 53rd Division landed with no artillery, no stores, and only one field ambulance. Kitchener even wrote to Winston Churchill about it. I am taking steps to having these generals replaced by real fighters. 2 days later, one corps commander and 2 divisional generals were relieved of command. Churchill's brother Jack, who was on Hamilton's staff, wrote about the men, though. They are not cowards. It is partly on account of their training. They have never seen a shot fired before. For a year, they have been soldiers, and during that time have been taught only one thing: trench warfare. They have been told to dig everywhere and have been led to expect an enemy at 100 yards. They have learned to regard an advance of 100 yards as a matter of the greatest importance. They landed and advanced half a mile and thought they had done something wonderful. They seemed not to know what to do. They showed extraordinary ignorance. This week there was again an Allied attack from Suvla Bay. They drove back the Ottomans for 8 hours, but the counterattack pushed them right back to their starting positions. It's the same thing over and over again. On August 19th, the White Star liner Arabic was torpedoed on Americans. This nearly prompted a diplomatic incident, but new German Nicosia, which was bringing mules from New Orleans to England, right? Then a British armored ship, the Barralong, came up flying the American flag, pretending to be an American merchant ship. It had on board 2 concealed guns and a platoon of Royal Marines. They suddenly lowered the flag, raised British colors, and opened fire on the sub. 12 of the sub's crew jumped into the water, and when the Marines opened fire on them, 6 were killed. The other 6 reached the Nicosia and tried to take refuge, but they were hunted down, killed by the Marines, and their bodies were thrown overboard. The German ambassador in Washington protested the use of the American flag to murder German sailors. The German surface fleet saw some action this week too. On the 18th, attacking the entrance to the Gulf of Riga, they were met with unexpected Russian skill. The Germans were forced to retire after losing 2 cruisers and 8 torpedo boats. The Russians lost only 1 gunboat. The following day, a German landing force at Pernau was destroyed by the Russians, and on the 20th, the Germans did manage to penetrate the Gulf, but were forced to retire. The landings failed. However, the German failure at sea in the Baltic paled in comparison to the success on land there. Kovno, one of the great symbols of Russian military might, fell to the Germans on the 17th after being under attack for a couple of weeks. Now, this was not just an immense blow to Russian pride, but a physical bounty for the Germans. Not only did all roads and railways from Russia to Germany pass through the city, but the Germans captured 1,365 big guns and 853,000 shells. The Russian commander of the fortress, General Grigoriev, fled before the Germans arrived and had failed to blow up the only railway tunnel between Ostend and Petrograd, did not blow the bridge over the Niemen River, and actually left the fortress without telling his chief of staff. He was court-martialed and sentenced to 8 years hard labor. In addition to the guns and shells, another of the spoils of victory was this. Several million tins of preserved meat were found in the fortress. This was the main Russian frontline supply. This week, like pretty much every week for the Russians lately, was bad along the whole eastern front. On the 15th, the Russian line at Bryansk was broken and 5,000 Russians were taken prisoner. On the 17th, the fortress of Novo-Georgievsk with 90,000 Russians inside was bombarded furiously and its outlying forts captured. That day, the Chelm-Brest-Litovsk railway line was cut. 2 days later, the mighty fortress of Novo-Georgievsk surrendered. The Russian army lost those 90,000 men, including officers, as prisoners of war. Now, that was on the 19th, but on the 17th, the total number of Russian prisoners of war in German camps was 726,694, and in Austro-Hungarian camps, 699,254, for a total of 1,425,848 prisoners. The 90,000 from Novo-Georgiev would push that to over 1.5 million. In case you were wondering how this compared to the other allies, the Germans held 330,000 British, French, and Belgians combined, a fifth of the number of Russians. As you may imagine, conditions in the camps could be inhumane. Actually, this month at the camp in Wittenberg, typhus had become so widespread that the administration abandoned the camp. Yep, they left. And there were 15,000 Russian, British, and French prisoners inside. They just surrounded them with a big perimeter fence backed by machine guns and attack dogs. And one final note for the week. On August 20th, Italy formally declared war on the Ottoman Empire. And the week comes to an end, with the Russians losing all along the Eastern Front, but beating back the Germans at sea. The Germans sank a liner with American passengers aboard, complained that the British duped them by fighting under an American flag, and abandoned the prisoners in a POW camp to disease. The Allies realized that Gallipoli was unwinnable with the current leadership and tactics, and it was business as usual in the West. 1.5 million Russian prisoners. The loss of Warsaw, Lemberg, Przemysl, and now both Kovno and Novo-Georgiev in the same week. 4 months of constant retreat, government officials being accused of treason, revolutionary fever in the ranks of the demoralized troops. By this time, the Russian army was down to fewer than 4 million men. But you know, I know, that this had happened before with Napoleon and would again with Hitler. And I think we are all aware that inflicting catastrophic losses on Russia does not cause Russia to surrender. And in August 1915, the Germans were becoming very aware of that. Hopes for a peace with Russia were receding, even as they took more and more land, and Russian shell production doubled between May and July and would soon top 1 million shells per month. Perhaps Wallace Shawn was right in The Princess Bride when he said the #1 classic blunder was never wage a land war in Asia. Just imagine how the Tsar must have felt during this time. He, the absolute ruler of Russia, which was now in dire straits. Now his fate is very much connected with the Great War and the fate of Russia in the 20th century. You can find out more about him in our portrait right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Angry Squirrel. Okay, thank you, Angry Squirrel, for your support. If you want more special episodes and more awesome animations, consider supporting us on Patreon. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next week. The Allies have tried for 4 months to push the Ottoman forces back at Gallipoli, but in vain. The Ottomans hold all of the high ground and are well dug in. So what are the British to do? They try exactly the same thing that failed before. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Germans captured 2 great Russian fortresses, Kovno and Novo-Georgiev, taking nearly 100,000 prisoners, several million tins of food, over 1,300 big guns, and over 830,000 artillery shells. The White Star liner Arabic was torpedoed by the Germans with Americans aboard. The German Navy was beaten back at the Gulf of Riga, and at Gallipoli, incompetence reigned among the Allies. I'm going to look far from Europe to start off today, where local action was preventing Indian troops from joining the war where they were most needed. Yep, in Rustam in northwest India, in what is now Pakistan, Bunarwal tribesmen were defeated the 26th by Gurkha troops of the Peshawar division. There had actually been scattered action there throughout the year, but it really heated up in mid-August as the Indian army fought the Mohmans, Bunarwals, and Swanti. These 3 tribes all inhabit the northern Peshawar district and fielded armies as large as 10,000 men. They would tie down the Indian troops for much of the rest of the year. Those troops would certainly come in handy at Gallipoli, for example. 2 weeks ago, the British had landed at Suvla Bay and tried and failed to push the Turks back. They held a line on the Suvla Plain with the Turks on the ridges around them. This week saw a final British assault on the 21st, but the Turks were well armed, dug in, and determined. The main objectives were the lowest foothills of the Chunuk-Bayer Range, Hill 60 and Scimitar Hill. One of the officers to lead the attack, Sir John Milbank, had won the Victoria Cross during the Boer War. After he got his orders, he went back to his men and said this: "We are to take a redoubt, but I don't know where it is, and I don't think anyone else knows either. But in any case, we're to go ahead. Milbank was killed, leading the advance. The attack on Scimitar Hill, actually, was the most costly proportionally and one of the least successful offensives of the whole Gallipoli campaign. 14,300 Allied troops took part, and it resulted in over 5,000 casualties. The enemy took half of that. It was, as was becoming a habit, a disaster. The artillery bombardment at its beginning was totally inadequate, and the infantry went over the top to be chopped down by Ottoman machine gun fire. Here's something from Captain Guy Nightingale of the 1st Royal Munster Fusiliers, which I found in Peter Hart's The Great War. At 3 p.m., the battalion shoved off 700 strong. The furthest any got was 500 yards, and none came back from there. They all got mown down by machine gun fire. We lost 9 officers and nearly 400 men. The Turks shelled us, and the whole country caught fire. Many of our wounded were burnt alive. The roar of the flames drowned out the noise of the shrapnel. After the gorse was all burnt, the smoke nearly asphyxiated us. All this time, our battalion was being cut up in the open. The telephone wires finally fused from the heat. A new general was now sent to Suvla, Sir Julian Byng from the Western Front. Byng told General Sir Ian Hamilton, in charge of Gallipoli, that there were not enough high-explosive shells to justify any more offensives. Hamilton deplored Byng's Western Front standards and said that if they were going to be fitted out properly, they'd be waiting until doomsday. The official Gallipoli historian, Brigadier General Aspinall Oglander, had this to say about Byng's arrival. The experienced pilot had arrived, but the ship to be steered into port was already hard on the rocks. And this was pretty much true. The Gallipoli campaign was basically just, waiting for the fat lady to sing, as the British mounted debacle after debacle. Thing is, Hill 60 and Scimitar Hill were sensible tactical objectives in general, since they would give a good position for a future offensive in the rather unlikely event that tens of thousands of new troops arrived to carry out a new offensive. But the desirability of 2 limited objectives is not a good reason to launch attacks that have virtually no chance of success and just lead to heavy casualties. Peter Hart, once again, had this to say in his book Gallipoli. These were pointless attacks, and if they typified any British trait, it was a lunatic persistence in the face of the obvious. The persistence of the Germans, however, was anything but lunatic as they continued to advance on the Eastern Front. The Russian retreat was becoming almost monotonous. This week they lost both Osoviets on the 22nd and Brest-Litovsk on the 25th to the advancing German Colossus. I say almost monotonous because far to the south, General Brusilov attacked Tarnopol on the 26th, taking 7,000 Austro-Hungarian prisoners. We've talked before about the staggering casualties on the Eastern Front on both sides, where Russia had now lost over 1.5 million men as prisoners to the Central Powers. But there were also huge casualties further south for people that weren't even fighting. I'm talking of the Armenian genocide, which had been going on for months. In fact, on August 19th, Lord James Bryce, who had been the first to speak about the genocide in the House of Lords, reported that 500,000 Armenians had now been killed. On the 26th, 60,000 Armenians in and around Aleppo were ordered to leave for Hawran in the Transjordan. Also this week, all soap, wood, coal, and copper are requisitioned from the homes of deported Armenians. It is forbidden for anyone to purchase the property of deported Armenians, and on August 31st, so 4 days in the future, cheating a little, Talat Pasha, Ottoman Minister of Finance and one of the 3 pashas that basically ran the empire, told the German ambassador in Constantinople that the Armenian question no longer exists. We haven't looked at the Western Front yet this week, and we saw a lot of action there in the skies. On August 23rd, a week of air raids began. During the week, the French would bomb Noyon, the Dillingen Iron Works, Dornach Poison Gas Factory, in Artois and in the Argonne, while the British bombed Lens, Henin-Lietard, Loos, and the German camps in Belgium. And there are, of course, scattered notes from the other theaters of war to round out the week. On the 27th, the Italians stormed Monterombo. That same day, Austro-Hungarian forces attack Montenegro at Grahovo, but are repulsed. At sea, a German destroyer was sunk by a French torpedo boat near Ostend, and a German sub was sunk by British airmen in the same area. And it is announced that British forces, including colonial forces, now total 3,825,000 men. That number is actually just about what the Russian army has been reduced to after the disasters of the past few months. And that's still weak. The Russians losing ever more ground to the Germans, the British and French attacking from above, Indian troops securing their frontiers, and another failed Allied offensive at Gallipoli. Here's yet another quote for the week, again from Peter Hart. The traditional analysis of the Anzac and Suvla operations of August 1915 has presented the fighting as a near-run thing, in which the British were only thwarted by a mixture of bad luck, poor command and control at Suvla, and the genius of Mustafa Kemal. This ignores clear evidence that once again, blind optimism had stood in the place of realistic planning. I mean, remember, the objective was removing the Ottoman Empire from the war, right? And it had degenerated into suicidal attempts to take something called Hill 60. And what if the Allies had succeeded and then taken Çanakkale above? What then? Well, they'd have to then take Maltepe, and then bring in enough troops to overrun the huge Turkish defenses on Kilid Bar, which guarded the Narrows. Then the fleet would have to penetrate the Sea of Marmara, which no one had seemingly made plans for. Then the Turkish fleet and the two German battle cruisers there would have to be dealt with. And then they could threaten Constantinople itself, and then what? The Turks would surrender? What a plan! And by around this time, of the 100,000 or so men on the peninsula, an estimated half were so disease-ridden they were unfit for duty. The troops had lost any faith in the future of the campaign. And yet, there they remained, with no hope of a clear-cut victory, and with Hamilton adamantly refusing to evacuate, and by now, mere survival was the only goal. If you're a frequent viewer of our show, you often hear me quoting great historians like, well, Peter Hart just now, or Martin Gilbert. And a lot of you ask us for book recommendations so you can go more in-depth into World War I. So, we came up with something, and we introduce you now to our very own Amazon store. You can click the button below or find the link in the description. This store contains works of both fiction and non-fiction that we either use as resources or we generally recommend because they're great books. And the cool thing is, if you buy one of these books via Amazon, you support our channel financially too, since we get a commission. The links are called affiliate links. And if you'd like to see how this whole mess in Gallipoli really got going, you can check out our episode about the attempt to force the Dardanelles right here. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Russia has been in deep trouble for months, retreating and losing territory week by week. And this week, the Tsar himself tries to do something about it. This week sees a full shakeup in the Russian High Command. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. The Allies had tried and failed again last week at Gallipoli with huge casualties, and the situation there was grim. The Russians had lost even more land to the Germans, but took a load of Austrian prisoners in the south. The war in the skies heated up in the west with bombing runs all week. The Armenian genocide grew ever worse, and the Indian Army secured its borders. To start off today, I'm not going to talk about a country or a front, but about a man. It's a man I haven't yet mentioned. On August 31st, one of the most daring and brilliant pilots of all time, the Frenchman Adolphe Pégoud, met his fate. Pégoud was a test pilot for Louis Blériot before the war, during which time he flew the first upside-down flight ever, was the first pilot to make a parachute jump, became the second pilot to loop-the-loop, and was the first flying ace, first to shoot down 5 or more planes. He died this week when he was shot down by one of his pre-war students, German Unteroffizier Walter Kandulski. He was 26 years old. Kandulski and his crew later dropped a wreath for Pégoud over the French lines. We haven't talked very much about the Western Front over the summer, mostly because there weren't any large offensives. And indeed, this week, there weren't any either. Just a week-long artillery duel. Yep, just. Though this was a relentless pounding of colossal proportions that never, ever stopped. But there was a lot going on behind the scenes in the planning stages at this point, which I want to take a look at. Now, the French High Command was determined to launch a major offensive this month, ideally to break through the German lines, but also to try to take some of the pressure off of the Russians, who had been retreating for 4 months now. But there was a lot of disagreement in the French High Command about exactly what they were going to do. General Joseph Joffre was in favor not of a breakthrough on a narrow front that could be fairly easily plugged, but a wide-ranging series of multiple offensives that would support each other and cause confusion in the German high command, foil the accurate deployment of reserves, and eventually break the lines entirely at a decisive point. Ferdinand Foch had ideas along the lines of the British bite and hold tactics, which would be much more methodical but restrained, and would involve a series of meticulously planned steps that would depend on the range of the artillery. General Philippe Pétain, who was now in charge of the Second French Army and a rising star, saw the war in simple terms of attrition. He believed the winner would be the last man standing, and his strategy was mostly defensive, and was designed to conserve manpower with the occasional limited attack to avoid large-scale losses. Thing is, none of these were really wrong, but they didn't really present any coherent solution considering what the Western Front was like by September 1915. The German lines, day by day, grew stronger with more trenches and more barbed wire. They now even had concrete fortifications as well as deeper dugouts and self-contained defense stations. They also had an entire second trench system back a couple miles behind the lines that was not within Allied field artillery range. It also didn't help that the Germans were at this point masters of the sky, thanks to the interrupter gear they had developed over the summer that allowed their pilots to fire their machine guns through their propellers. Okay, German numbers on the Western Front had been a bit down, since many soldiers had been sent east to fight the Russians. But what would the French do against the increasingly well-entrenched Germans? Well, Joffre's solution for that was to take a page from Mackensen's book, August von Mackensen being the German general whose artillery had precipitated the Russian retreat in the first place. Joffre planned, to put it simply, to blast the German positions from the face of the earth. And to do this, he demanded more and more heavy artillery, so that it would be roughly the same numbers as his field artillery. And by this time, the French had 4,646 field guns and 3,538 heavy guns. This was Joffre's battering ram, and they began to plan for the day when the hammer would finally come down. And speaking of the Russian retreat, the Germans had been forcing the Russians back in Poland and the Baltic and driven them from Warsaw and Kovno. And this week, they were advancing towards the Niemen River and the last Russian stronghold on it, the fortress of Grodno. On August 30th, German forces stormed the city of Lipsk, less than 30 kilometers west of Grodno, and south of the Niemen they advanced on the Grodno-Vilnius Railway. On the 31st came the first reports that the devastating German heavy artillery had been brought up and was shelling the fortress from the west. There was not much hope left for the Russians there, for at every point those guns had been brought to bear. They had blasted their way to the goal, no matter how strong or modern the defenses. Indeed, Grodno fell to Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg's army on September 2nd, after they forced the crossing of the Niemen River. The four historic Russian frontier fortresses, Kovno, Novogeorgievsk, Brest-Litovsk, and Grodno, had now all fallen, and the Germans set their sights on Vilnius, the most important of the western cities of the Russian Empire since Warsaw had fallen. But the Russians had, by abandoning the entire Polish salient, shortened their front from 1,000 to 600 miles, which of course gave them a much better economy of force. So they could now send reserves to the Baltic and the center, and to even counterattack, as they did at Lutsk on the 1st, taking 7,000 German prisoners, and also in South Galicia, where on August 30th they took 4,000 prisoners and 30 big guns. But the demoralization of the Russian army after the months of retreat and loss was undeniable, and there had been rumors about changes in the Russian leadership for weeks. This week, those rumors became fact. The Grand Duke Nikolai was dismissed as commander of the Russian armies this week and would be replaced by Tsar Nicholas himself. He would be more the new head in name, though, and the man who would really direct the armies was the new Chief of Staff of Stavka, General Mikhail Alexeyev. But the Tsar's future, as the now personal leader, was now really tightly bound to the successes and failures of his armies. Those armies were now divided up on three fronts. The north, now once again under General Nikolai Ruski, the west under General Alexei Evert, and the southwest under Nikolai Ivanov. The Grand Duke Nikolai, after his removal from office, was appointed Viceroy of the Caucasus on the 3rd. Minister of War Alexei Polivanov, who was very much against the Tsar taking personal control, announced this week that Russia would raise another 2 million men. And in a related note, German General Hans Hartwig von Bessler was appointed the Governor General of the former Russian territories of Poland, now in German hands. And this week we also saw once again that it was indeed a world war. In northwest India, the Indian Army again defeated the Bunarwal tribesmen, this time at the Malandri Pass on August 28th. After 2 more skirmishes during the week, they were finally scattered on September 2nd. And in German East Africa, British mounted infantry beat the enemy near Mactan. Further north on the Italian front, the Italians took Monte Sista on the 28th, but unsuccessfully assaulted the bridgehead of Tolmino September 2nd. And that brings us to the end of the week of a war fought on 3 continents by soldiers from 5. The Russians radically changed their high command, even as they finally have some success counterattacking, but lose their last great European fortress to the Germans. Plans are being hatched on the Western Front as the artillery pounds away and the first flying ace dies. It's true what I said earlier, that setbacks to the Russian armies would now reflect upon the Tsar himself, which is why the cabinet nearly unanimously opposed it. It would be a few days before it was all official, but still, the Tsar was not a military strategist. Having said that, the man he replaced, his cousin, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, had never commanded in the field before the war broke out, and he was suddenly given command of the largest army ever put in the field in history up to that point. Okay, he didn't do all that badly, all things considered, but you would think the Russians would want a real field leader in command. You'd be wrong, though, since Russia continually moved incompetent officers up through its ranks in a system riddled with nepotism, patronage, and political intrigue, and it reflected in the field. We've seen so many Russian failures that could have been prevented, that have resulted in hundreds of thousands of needless deaths, but all too often, the feeling of the Russian leadership was, so what? It's only men. The Russians had been retreating since the beginning of May when the German Gorlitz-Tarnov offensive kicked off. If you'd like to see our episode about how that all got started, you can check it out right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is James the Pony Theorist, which is pretty cool. James's contribution on Patreon meant that we could improve our digital map and our animations. If you want to help make our show better, check out our Patreon page. And for more in-depth discussions on our episodes, you can subscribe to our ever-growing Great War subreddit. See you next time. We've watched the war in the skies as it's grown ever larger, and with it has grown the need for defense from it. Something to protect the troops and the public at home from death from above. The need for anti-aircraft weaponry.